This is part 2 of chapter 9. So when I finished part 1, we were talking about POW, pick ideas, organize notes, write and say more, all about this pre-writing and planning process. And then there's another one that kind of extends it, POW tree or POW plus tree. This is from this is from a different textbook, but I wanted to include the POW plus tree as well. And again, I worked with Mason, I don't say her name here, but so POW plus tree is to pick my idea, organize my notes, write and say more, and then kind of under that W is topic sentence, reasons, three or more with explanations, ending, wrap it up, and examine, do I have all the parts? So that's another strategy that, some of your students might find, especially some of your older students. For the younger students, you might want to just stick with POW, but for your older student, you might want to add in the tree part as well. So I wanted to make sure I shared that with you. Okay, and so then we want to think about, so that was kind of talking about pre-writing, right, and planning. And now we want to talk about composing and revising, which are kind of those next steps in the writing process. So you want to think about writing well-developed, or think about how to provide support for your students so that they can write well-developed stories or essays. So you maybe want to use some cue cards, where, when, characters, problem, plan, ending. Think sheets like I showed you in figure 9-9, and then there's also 9-10. Those will help with planning and organizing ideas. I showed you that in part 1. You want to think about lively verbs and vivid words and combining short sentences, stuff like that. So, explicitly teaching and modeling these things, these items for your students. And then when it comes time to revise, there's another strategy called fix. And this was new to me, actually. Focus on essay elements. Okay, so there's your F. I, identify problems. And X, execute, notice the big X, changes. Okay, so again, these strategies, you would teach them explicitly. You would say to them, today we're going to learn a new strategy. This will help with our writing. And, all of your students might not need this, but if you think about what I showed you in part 1 about how setting up the stage, and you had that C-shaped table, maybe you have a group, a little small group that you need to explicitly teach them maybe this strategy. So you could do a little lesson with them. I'm going to teach you a new strategy. Here's how, you can use the strategy to help you revise your writing. Listen to me, watch me, and think back even to that video that I did for your instructional activities, that video about the FAST, F-A-S-T strategy. Think about how explicit I was with that. So that's what you would want to do with any new strategy, including this fixed strategy or POW plus tree or something like that. Okay, and you want to use expert writings as a model. You can draw a box around a key sentence, use it to extend or explode the idea and clarify. All of those are some other strategies that might be successful for you. Okay, and then talking about the next stages or the next steps, editing and publishing. So you want to think about, I'll come back to 9.11 in a minute. So you want to think about editing, spelling, punctuation, language, all of those things. This is where you could use some peers, get some peers to do some peer editing, also some self-editing. They could have some checklists. And you could teach your students to follow the editing rules in figure 9-12 and look at the apply 9-6 about giving feedback. And then you want to think about publishing. And of course, publishing doesn't mean, every time we're going to send it to a publishing house and that's a little dramatic. But you want to think about how you can share what your students write, whether it's they create a self-made book with handmade illustrations. You maybe laminate it, you bookbind it, something like that. I use the bookbinder and the laminator all the time when I taught elementary school, all the time. And you could share it publicly with a broader audience. I know a lot of schools now do grandparents tea or mom's day or whatever, and they share some writing. The student gets to sit in a big fancy chair and they share. You could share with other classes. You could if you have some teaching older students, you could have them read to some of the younger students in the school, something like that. Or just have within your class, have an author's chair or something like that, and have the students, if they want to share, give them those opportunities to share. All right, so let me show you figure 9.11, 9.11. Oh, just realized that. But I think this is really helpful. Recommendations from research on teaching writing, IES practice guide. This is the Institute of Educational Sciences, but that totally might be a lie. Institute of Education Sciences. Look, there you go. But it's a Department of Ed entity. So you might want to think about this too. Daily time for students to write, all students, right? Teach students to use the writing process. So kind of what we talked about, various strategies, guide students. So kind of that guided practice, encourage students to be flexible, teach students to write for a variety of purposes, right? Not just because they have to, but what are some other purposes of writing? Who could their audience be? Not just the teacher, oh, I have to write this, but who else could be their audience? Teach students to become fluent with handwriting, spelling, sentence construction, stuff like that, typing, word processing. Okay, and then create an engaged community of writers. You want an engaged community of learners overall, but specifically in writing, because a lot of students, they don't like to write and they don't like to spell, especially now with spell check and everything so readily available. They don't really think spelling and writing are important. So you want to make sure that they are engaged in the writing process. All right, so again, you want to think about establishing a writing community. Writing conferences are something that are very effective. This might be where you pull a student one-on-one for 5 minutes, whatever it is. And you can ask the student about specific areas about their writing. You can allow time or make sure to allow time for their responses. And then you could also make suggestions. Okay, and then you want to think about a writing community, again, within your classroom. Maybe you team teach with another second grade teacher. Maybe you would, that could be your writing community. Share your writing again within the classroom with other classes. That's kind of what we talked about. Help students with diverse backgrounds and, of course, with special needs. So you want to look at Apply 9-11 and 9-12. All right, so you also want to think about how you can use technology to facilitate writing. Some of our students with learning problems or behavior problems, they might have some fine motor skills. They might struggle with the actual act of handwriting. So maybe we could use some technology for them to make the writing process a little easier, right? So spell check, we just talked about that a minute ago. If they have bad handwriting, that was very like Chicago right there. Like I do, my handwriting is terrible, terrible. My students used to make fun of me. Like my elementary school students used to laugh at my handwriting. That's how bad it is. So for someone like me, and it's not that I have fine motor issues. I'm a right-handed person, but I write like I'm a left-handed person. It's not pretty. But for some of your students who might have some of those fine motor skills, you want to make sure their writing is legible. So allow them to use the computer, something like that. Right, so again, going back to RTI, response to intervention, remember, or MTS squared, provide extra writing time and extra instruction. So not just, okay, here you go, here's more time to write, but actually, what else can I do? What other instruction can I provide for these students? Use research-based strategies. We talked about a bunch of those, and maintain copies of their writing so you can monitor their progress and show them their progress. They like to know that they're doing better, so show them their progress. Compare something they wrote in August with something they write in April or something like that and show them the differences. And then your older students, you want to think about really promoting that planning, revising, and editing. Okay, you also want to think about teaching writing in the content areas, of course, because there are writing standards, social studies, history, science, all of these things. Arguments, narration of historical events, scientific procedures, stuff like that. They could conduct research. It doesn't have to be fancy research, but they could take a poll. They could do something pretty kind of low tech. And you also want to think about addressing challenges for students with writing difficulties. So teach students to evaluate sources, determine if their credibility or determine the source's credibility, aka Wikipedia, not so credible, right? Because anybody can go in there and change it. So you want to think about stuff like that. Facilitate long-term written assignments in content areas, so maybe something they work on over 2 weeks or something like that. And then think about how your writing instruction in the content area could also improve learning in that content area. All right, so that was kind of writing, the written expression process, handwriting. Oh, excuse me, not handwriting, writing. And now, because handwriting comes up. So now teaching and spelling. So you might want to conduct an error analysis of student writing and spelling tests to see if they're making the same errors. Or is there a pattern that are they always missing the I before E or something like that? Are they not dropping the Y when they're making certain words plural, whatever. See if you can find patterns, stuff like that. So to teach students with learning problems, you want to think about, again, that direct, explicit instruction. Sufficient practice, feedback, instructional language, peer tutoring, all of these things that we've talked about a lot already. Maintain previously learned words, use games, activities, stuff like that. So some other things, teach in small units, small kind of chunks. Teach those spelling patterns or word families, stuff like that. Teach spelling through direct instruction. Spelling kind of gets forgotten about sometimes, especially now that we do have spell check, but we want to make sure our students at least have those spelling patterns and those word families. You want to use instructional language, motivate your students to spell correctly, and include dictionary training. Um, there are so many students who have no idea what a dictionary is. So you want to make sure you're including that in your instruction. I know dictionaries are kind of old school, but they're still important. I still use them sometimes. So some spelling approaches and practices, and these are of course all in your textbook as well, so you might want to check that out for some more detail. Test, study, test, so you give them a test, they study missed words, then you give them a retest. Visualization approach where they could picture the spelling of the word in their head or even, down their arm. We used to use I cannot for the life of me remember what it was called in Charleston. It wasn't Read Well, it wasn't Read 180, but it was something like that. And, we would have the students spell the words out along their arm. If the word was cat, they would do the C up at their shoulder, the A at the elbow, and the T at the wrist, and then they would blend it together, cat. But if they do something like that, or skywrite, something like that, that gives them a picture of the word. Okay, there's also the 5-step word study, say, write, trace, write again, check. Johnson and Michael Bust work from partial to total recall, so kind of looking at some of the word to all the word. Close, and then Fernald method, which is that multi-sensory, and some other effective practices. Weekly word list, where you are again looking at their errors and modeling correct spelling. 3 words per day. Okay, and computer assisted instruction programs, peer tutoring, games, whatever else you can find. All right, I have a few more slides and only a few more minutes. So you also want to think about teaching handwriting, like actual handwriting. We don't want to talk about my letter formation, letters crowded. So all of these would lead to a lack of fluency and slow writing. They might not like it. So then guess what? You might want to think about letting them use the keyboard. Okay, so some reversals. Oh, where'd it go? Sorry, I apparently moved the thing. So some direct instruction. Again, you want to trace the letters, describe the characteristics, ask the student to model the same procedure. Maybe there's a mnemonic picture device, something like that, that helps students recall the direction of the letter, B and D, stuff like that. Handwriting, oh boy, legibility, I know. We don't even want to know. We don't want to know, I promise. So there are a lot of common errors forming some of those letters, especially with legibility. Some other errors, spacing between letters, where everything just kind of is all jumbled. You have no idea what word is what. So you want to work on some fluent writing skills with your students. You want them to write quickly with ease without undue attention to letter formation. You want them just to be able to write. Right, R-I-G-H-T. So you could obtain a fluency sample and then gradually increase expectations for speed in letter formation. Okay, a couple other things, some handwriting problems. All of these are characteristic handwriting problems, and I know I kind of talked about that a minute ago right here. This is just kind of a little more in depth. Oh my gracious day. All right, and then reversals, we talked about that as well. Reversals are common before the age of 6 or 7, so don't necessarily freak out if you have, you're teaching 5-year-olds and they're writing numbers or letters backwards. But maybe after about age 7 or 8-ish, some of them might need direct intervention techniques. So again, you can think about this. And again, I know this is from the older edition, remember, and I know this was on the slide a few minutes ago as well. All right, so handwriting problems, we kind of talked about this. Use paper with more space between lines, right? Use some of that really widely spaced paper. Provide models. Teach self-regulation behaviors. Use self-assessment and self-instruction, stuff like that. So that is, I think that's from a prior edition of the textbook as well. Okay, and then some additional evidence-based instructional activities. All of these are in your textbook. Well, excuse me, this is from the 2015 edition, so I assume all of these are in your textbook, but I'm not 100% positive, to be honest. But just some other ideas, graphic organizers. We'll talk a lot more about those in chapter 10. Peer revision, what would you do a step-by-step cartoon writing, stuff like that. So lots of options and lots of activities. I know there are evidence-based instructional activities in your textbook, in your current edition. I just honestly don't know if these are the same ones because I just realized that that was from the past edition. All right, so that's it for chapter 9, writing and spelling.